This is, of course, just the latest in a series of moves by Xi Jinping's government to crack down on tech in China. But this seems particularly targeted towards a company that just listed publicly in the United States. What's your take on this?
We hear a lot that the Chinese government is looking to rein in, to assert its control over the powerful tech platforms. But let's drill down a little bit deeper in that. What makes these companies so powerful is because of the vast troves of data that they sit on. This is valuable for commercial and for political reasons. And it's interesting, the tools that they've used to go after Didi are cybersecurity review, essentially a black box review of their data security practices, as well as their management of personal data on the mobile app. So this is, I think, the #1 regulatory risk for domestic and foreign companies, data security.
Right, but what do you make of the timing happening, within days of its public listing? And interestingly, Didi went public in the middle of the celebration of the anniversary of the Communist Party. They didn't do any media interviews that we typically do during a listing process. So that was interesting as well. But doesn't the timing seem interesting to you?
The timing is interesting, and I think there are two separate stories that are colliding here. One is, it's very likely that Didi was actually undergoing a cybersecurity review of its data practices in secret, and that's typically not a transparent process, and that they may have rushed forward with the IPO before getting the blessing from regulators that they were in the clear in terms of coming into compliance on domestic data security practices. That's #1. #2, I think that there were clearly officials that were not happy with the overseas listing, and there's a broader effort where the Chinese government is essentially rethinking its stance on sending its tech darlings to list on overseas markets.
Now, to put this into context, China and the Chinese government has gone to great lengths to push U.S. big tech out of China, shutting down Facebook, Twitter, Google, leaving the country. And the sort of conventional narrative is that that has helped bolster Chinese technology companies. I wonder, though, are the Chinese government's latest moves coming at the expense of Chinese companies, and why would they do that?
Oftentimes, I think there's a tendency to look at moves by the Chinese government as coordinated in order to sort of act in the best interest of Chinese companies going global. That's not necessarily what's happening. Even though the Xi Jinping government has said we want to have globally successful Chinese brands that can operate outside of China's closed and protected system, oftentimes the left hand is not talking to the right, and you have security objectives of the government that are in many ways undermining the efforts of those same companies to go out and compete successfully in global markets. And that's what's happening here.
So what do you see longer term in terms of U.S.-China relations? Do you see a complete decoupling, at least a financial decoupling, of the U.S. and China? Because they are, obviously there are several Chinese companies that are listed in the United States. Do you see, perhaps a financial decoupling?
This move is certainly a shortcut to financial sector decoupling. And these companies are caught between Washington and Beijing. Beijing wants them to come back and list domestically. And on Washington's side, they've put forward a much more rigorous auditing process requiring Chinese companies to essentially open up their audit books or be forced to delist within 3 years. And I think that's also what was driving this. The kind of data that would be exposed potentially in that audit process in the US is not something the Chinese government has any interest in disclosing to foreign regulators. So certainly on the financial side, decoupling, and there are a number of tools that are in play right now which will determine how far that decoupling goes.
So what is your outlook for a company like Didi? What's your outlook for a company like ByteDance, which was planning to go public, and now that's on hold?
So I think the idea of wholesale decoupling is actually somewhat of a red herring. We're going to see ad hoc, sort of some areas where these are companies that are going to be under increased pressure to sort of shift their global ambitions and focus more on China's domestic market. So for ByteDance, we saw this for Huawei earlier. Now we're seeing it for Didi. I think there's going to be a much more inward focus as they look to line up with domestic regulation on the security side and now on the data security side.